And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I welcome you to America at a Crossroads program tonight. My dear colleague, David Lehrer, is on vacation this week. We wish him safe travels. Thanks, as always, to our leadership team, including Zev Yaroslavsky and former Congressman Mel Levine. And a special welcome and thank you to tonight's guest, Mark Oppenheimer, and to our moderator, Larry Mantle. I'll just show you a quick picture of Mark Oppenheimer's most recent book, which you'll hear about during the program tonight. And we're also excited to welcome him in Los Angeles, but probably nationwide, as the new director of open learning at the American Jewish University. Next week, on August 9th, we will hear from former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who will be in conversation with political sociologist and global democracy expert Larry Diamond of the Spogli Institute at Stanford on the topic of momentous events in Russia and Ukraine. What do they mean? Then on August 16th, we will return to the explosive topic of the American political scene with acclaimed pundit and analyst David Gergen. David will be in conversation with Madeline Brand. If there's anybody who can help us better understand and reflect on the crazy current political situation, it's David Gergen. In the following weeks, we will hear from one of the most respected abortion law experts in the country, Mary Ziegler. That's on August 23rd. And then on August 30th, we'll hear from the Dean of Berkeley School of Law, Erwin Chemerinsky, who is considered to be one of the most brilliant constitutional scholars in the country. So August with America at a Crossroads is replete with outstanding programming to keep you, our audience, informed on law, politics, foreign affairs, and current events. And we are almost completely booked with an amazing September lineup, which we should be able to post and announce next week. So stay tuned. Your donations ensure America at a Crossroads continued operations. David and I are volunteers, as of course are Zev and Mel. All of the funds you donate are used to actually pay for our programs. We have no staff. There are some changes at Eventbrite, and now you will be able to connect to our program from the Zoom link in your Eventbrite registration. We will, however, continue to send the Zoom link as we always have via email, but we're hoping that this change at Eventbrite will make it more efficient for you to access our weekly programs. But don't be worried. If you're used to doing it the way you have been doing it, you'll still be able to do it that way. Tonight's moderator, Larry Mantle, has been the host of Air Talk on NPR member station LAist, formerly known as KPCC, since April 1st, 1985. Air Talk is the longest running daily talk show in Southern California. Larry has received countless awards for his journalism, including the Associated Press's prestigious Mark Twain Award. Larry is a veritable institution in Southern California and an overall wonderful friend and human being. And I'm very pleased to present Larry tonight. Larry?
Thank you, Janice. As always, it's such a pleasure to be with you for another America at a Crossroads. My thanks to Zev and to Mel as well, and David in absentia as he vacations. Hearing who the speakers are coming up the rest of this month, Erwin Chemerinsky, Mary Ziegler, Mike McFaul. I mean, it's an extraordinary lineup of people who are talking. And just as tonight, we have a superb guest who is going to be joining us. So I really enjoy the privilege of getting to be part of these conversations on so many of these weeks. As Janice said, no paid staff to do this, but all of these terrific guests are really a testament to Janice and David with the assistance of Zev and Mel's wonderful input on putting these speakers together. This evening, we are so pleased to have with us Mark Oppenheimer, who wrote the Beliefs column for the New York Times from 2010 to 2016. That gave him a chance to write about a wide range of faiths, the evolution of their practices, and what they mean to their congregants. His writing is also available at places where he currently contributes or where he's written in the past. It includes Tablet, Slate, the LA Times, The Forward, New York Times Magazine, the New York Times Book Review, and the Boston Globe. His latest book, as Janice just showed you, Squirrel Hill, The Tree of Life Synagogue Shooting, and The Soul of a Neighborhood. We'll talk later this hour about the federal jury's decision for the death sentence for the killer, that sentence announced earlier today. Mark Oppenheimer has a new job here in Los Angeles as the Vice President and Director of Open Learning at American Jewish University in the Sepulveda Pass, and he's based in New Haven, Connecticut. Mark, it's so good to have you with us on America at a Crossroads. Good evening.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
We see tremendous shifts taking place in American religious life, and these shifts are taking place concurrently with many others. We're getting married less often, and people that do get married are getting married later in life. We're having fewer children, and we're finding much of our social life moving from in-person to social media groups online. How does the move that we're seeing generally in our religious lives relate to these other moves? Are they all part of a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think let me start here. One of the tendencies in talking about American religion is a tendency that occurs, especially not just with boomers, but with Gen Xers like myself, and maybe with everybody who's interested in American history, that occurs when talking about any aspect of American life, which is we tend to compare stuff against the post-war era. There's a sense in which the Eisenhower years, the Kennedy years, let's say 1948 to 1963 or so, feels like some sort of peak of peacefulness, of prosperity. If you're on the left, you'd look at union membership and say it was super high. If you were interested in defense, you would say this was a moment when America's footprint abroad was so unquestioned. And we tend to see the 50s as some sort of halcyon days. That is certainly the case with religion. We can say that church and synagogue membership circa 1960 was higher than it ever has been since. The tricky thing is it was also higher than it had ever been before. The reality is that America in the 17 and 1800s was much more far-flung. A lot of people lived very, very far from houses of worship. They didn't have cars. People were relatively unchurched in, say, the 1830s or 40s, and as they are relatively unchurched today. So what you had was a peak circa 1959, 60, 61. And on either side of it is really the norm. The norm being that most people, that churches are not at the center of communities and everyone's lives in the way that we tend to envision when we think of a kind of post-war America. So
I was going to say, so is much of that related to Cold War America? Because, my sense of at least church going, and I can't speak to synagogue attendance or membership, but I think church going is very much seen as sort of what a moral person does. It is an indicator of that you hold certain values, Judeo-Christian values, that are seen as universal American values as well. And it's one of the ways you demonstrate them.
Right, absolutely. There was a moment during the Cold War when atheism was seen as akin to communism, and going to church, or at least affiliating, right? Whether you attended every week or not, the idea was you'd belong to a house of worship. If people said, "Where do you go?" it was useful to say, "I go to St. Luke's Episcopal," or "I go to Temple, Beth Shalom, or Emmanuel, or B'nai Jacob," whatever. You wanted to have something to say, because to say we don't go anywhere could be seen as fairly suspicious. But the other thing that was going on in the post-war era was that people were still largely living in ethnic enclaves. Either they were still in ethnic neighborhoods in the cities, where if you were Roman Catholic, if you were Italian or Polish or Irish American, you were living near your parish. And so there was a sense in which all eyes were on you. You better go. Or even if you were suburbanizing, the initial first ring suburbs that people moved to were often pretty ethnically homogeneous. So you might move to a Jewish suburb, where 30 to 40, 60% of the people were Jewish. Not all of them, but enough that a lot of your social life might be organized around the temple or synagogue. So there were these structural factors that made America a religiously engaged place in the 50s and 60s. And those began to atrophy very, very quickly. I mean, that moment was very brief. And by the time you get to the late 1960s, attendance is starting to fall off a cliff. So to circle back to your question, I mean, yes, there's a way in which certain recent trends, like our desire to do stuff from home or to be online, or the fact that we suburbanize even more all the time and move farther and farther from each other, they affect religion as well as other aspects of life. But this is not a trend. These things aren't the last 5 years. This is really something that started in the 60s and has fallen off a cliff more recently.
Well, and one of the things that I see in this time where more and more people are said to be, quote, unchurched, is that for many people, they are spending a lot of time on the subject of religion online and looking at courses on different faiths, watching services online, that just because people are not going to a house of worship, a physical place, doesn't mean that that their heart is not going to a place of learning or worship.
Yeah, Larry, you're taking us right to the heart of it. We're getting to the good stuff right away. That is true. However, notice that what you've done is just kind of set up two fairly different conceptions of religion. One, William James, the great American philosopher and theorist of religion, right, who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience, he had a quote that was something like, "Religion is what man does in his solitude." Okay, that is kind of the defining quote of the spiritualist tradition, where the people who say, well, my religion is a hike in the woods, right? They might also say, my religion is going online and reading interesting texts or watching interesting sermons by myself, right? It's something they do in their solitude for their own nourishment. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is, again, a great world and American tradition. However, it is radically different from congregating with other people in a social unit. I would almost say it's you could even see it as the opposite of that, right? William James thought the quintessential religious, he would have said man, but I would say person, was somebody on a walk in the woods in solitude, communing with like the great eternal. And a lot of people feel like actually the quintessential religious person is somebody going to a congregation, enmeshing themselves in other people's lives. When somebody dies, going to their funeral, taking care of their widow or widower, bringing them meals when a baby is born. Like it's a social versus non-social conception. And that's a really different thing.
It is. And this, of course, fits into Putnam's writing about bowling alone and
Sure.
all the institutions that we've seen on the decline in America. People don't bowl in leagues. They don't join fraternal and women's groups at the same level. All of these sorts of things. And it does seem that synagogues and churches are very much in that same category.
Yeah, I mean, look, associational, associations, voluntary associations have taken a huge hit. Again, they probably peaked sometime in the fairly immediate post-war eras. So it's not just, I mean, it's interesting when I'm trying to make some of these points about religious life, because religion is such a kind of toxic or hot or controversial topic for a lot of people, I'll say, let's not talk about religion. Let's talk about everything else that your parents would have joined. The League of Women Voters, the Elks Club, the Masons, a labor union, a local Democratic or Republican ward committee, the PTO. I mean, it's like thing after thing that if I look at my mom and dad, what they were doing with their evenings and weekends, when I was growing up in Springfield, Massachusetts, voluntary association after voluntary association. And the question I say to people is, forget church, synagogue. Maybe you have feelings that you'll never be, going to mosque, church, synagogue, Hindu temple, whatever. But your parents or grandparents were going to 20 other voluntary associations having to do with sports, recreation, being parents, the local, cleaning up the parks, whatever, the local, Rotary, Chamber of Commerce. Are you doing any of those? And what's interesting is how many people have dropped out of associational life altogether. That can't be good for a people. Partly because it raises levels of mistrust. I mean, people have to be together and hang out in order to trust each other.
Well, and there's the whole issue of, some of those organizations you mentioned, there is a sense of shared values that is at the heart of it. Others not necessarily. Of course, what religious communities do is hang their hat on the shared values. So if you're going to the house of worship with people who are like-minded, this is typically going to express itself in welfare measures for others who share your perspective, which may or may not be true with some of these other, civic groups.
can I be cheeky and say I'm not sure that's right?
Yeah, no,
I actually,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So yes, that it can work that way. It absolutely can work that way, right? That the religious organization, church, synagogue, mosque, temple, whatever, coven, you name it, functions to bring together like-minded people who then do for other like-minded people. It can also work in very different ways. It can bring together like-minded people who then say our charitable efforts are going to be directed toward people who have nothing in common with us, right? We are wealthy, but we're going to support a soup kitchen or a homeless shelter or whatever for a group of people who are less wealthy, right? Who maybe live in a different neighborhood. It can also, and I think this is something to be valued, right? It used to be that a religious community didn't necessarily bring together people of shared values. So, for example, you said that you have a Presbyterian heritage, Larry. Now, it used to be, let's say you were of Scottish Presbyterian heritage and you moved to a new city and you wanted to have a community. You and your spouse on landing would find the Presbyterian church and you would join, and it was probably half Republican and half Democrat, or 70-30 or
Yes,
60-40.
yeah.
And it was diverse by age. There were elderly people and there were babies, and it might be diverse by neighborhood. All they had in common was descended from Scottish immigrants, and they felt that Presbyterian was their church. But within that, there actually might be tremendous diversity. So that's just to say that a house of worship at its best, or I don't want to say its best, one great thing it can do is actually bring together people who otherwise wouldn't talk to each other.
Well, but you know, in the era that you're talking about, religion would not be the division that it is today, Mark. And so it sort of brings me to the next point I was going to raise is it seems to me that we add onto our political beliefs a kind of moral judgment that, you know, has always been there to some extent, of course, but not to the degree, at least, you know, from mid-20th century on, that we see it now, to where people look at those who have, you know, different views as essentially being immoral. And it seems like sort of the moral judgments that we used to have between religious groups are now between political orientations.
Alas, right? I think you're right about that, and I think that's a crying shame. I mean, I think it's a failure when a particular synagogue or church is the place where the Republicans go, or the Trump voters go, or the liberals go, or the leftists go. Like, if things are working well, one way things can work well is to bring together people who actually disagree a lot on contemporary issues or current events, and maybe the church is the space where they talk about them, or where they see each other's humanity, even though they disagree, right? So when I go to my synagogue on Saturday on the Sabbath, I actually don't try to talk politics. And this is a different conception. Some people feel it should be the most political place, and I respect that conception of it. Some people feel it should be sometimes political, that there are times when the rabbi must give a sermon on something important that's come up. But one of the virtues of it can be, it's a space where you go to revel in the humanity of the people sitting all around you without getting in political fights, because they actually have depths and value and humanity irrespective of their political beliefs. And
So
I
the
think that's a
idea is we're
really
more than
valuable
our
thing.
politics, that's not
Absolutely.
the totality of our identity.
I think you just said it better than I was. Yes, that we are more than our. But one of the things religion can do is take an eternal view, sort of under the eternal eye, taking us out of the contemporary moment and saying, what are we in the eyes of the Lord, the universe, nature, whatever you want to call it, that is more than the ballot I just cast, or the argument I just got in, or, you know, the Facebook post I just put up. I think that's so important. I think it's so crucial to our humanity.
What do you think, Mark, is behind people's move towards extremes in religion? And again, we've always had that, but, you know, toward things like Christian nationalism, or we've seen the rise, of course, of ultra-Orthodox, and I'm not comparing the two morally.
Yeah,
I'm just saying that they're more, so I want to be very clear about that. But moving more to the extremes of belief, unfortunately, with Christian nationalism, it takes a pernicious turn. But how do we get there?
I mean, there are a lot of things that are going on when you're talking about the polarization of American religion, and one is that When we're talking about the United States, it's a country that has been pushed to extremes where we have radicalized and polarized. If you read a book like Ezra Klein's book, Why We're Polarized, he adduces a lot of important reasons why. A lot of it has to do with the ways in which our news consumption has been, sliced and diced up so that we're consuming news that seems, more amenable to us. And I think, and that also a lot has to do with the decline of the local media. Instead of getting one local newspaper and knowing what's going on, because local issues tend to be less balkanized, tend to be less partisan. Everyone wants their potholes fixed. But when we're only consuming national news on Fox or MSNBC or whatever, those tend to be more hot issues, more polarized issues. So there are a lot of things going on. One of the other things that's going on is when you say that it's getting polarized, part of what you mean is that these words aren't perfect, but conservative or hyper-traditionalist or religions seem to be the only religions in town. Part of that is because, what you might call liberal or moderate or centrist religions, sort of mainline Protestantism, for example, those are the people who largely have stopped going. They don't attend as much. They don't join as much. They have lower birth rates. I mean, for all sorts of reasons, there's not as much vigor in those, what you might call crudely sort of moderating religious communities. So there you go.
So the extremes are the ones that are growing, and I know even among evangelical Christianity there has been a decline, but nowhere near, as you're saying, with the mainline Protestant denominations who are selling off churches right and left because there's no one going.
It's really quite striking. I mean, I live in a city that is one of the original American homes of mainline Protestantism, and church after church. I know Jews who belong and attend. I know Roman Catholics who belong and attend. I know almost no white Protestants, and I know African American and Latino Protestants who belong and attend. I know almost no white Protestants. I know almost no white Protestants in this. If what we mean is somebody who attaches
non-evangelical, yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I know almost no evangelical.
Really?
I mean, some. Okay. I do know some, and that's. Yeah, so if I were saying,
I know a lot of those, but okay.
But so many fewer than 20 years ago. I mean, what's really interesting, if you look, for example, 25 years ago, the Southern Baptist Convention appeared to be this unstoppable juggernaut. It was baptizing more people every year. And now baptisms have declined for several years in a row. And, it's a lot harder to find, say, a 16 or 20 or 24-year-old who feels passionately committed to the Southern Baptist Church.
I think that what we see here in Southern California, though, Mark, so many Latinos who are evangelical Christian, they don't go to Southern Baptist Church. They go to what may be small, non-denominational. They may be Pentecostal, they may not be, but they're in that tradition. And so many of that, unless you're polling the religious views of Latinos, you're not necessarily picking up on that expression of Christianity that we see a lot of in Southern California.
Look, no question. Like the Latino Pentecostal explosion, and by the way, you would see it in the African Pentecostal explosion too. Nigeria, for example, is one of the facts that complicates all of this. Though my sense is it's still slowing down relative to 10 or 20 years ago. I mean, and that the younger generations are still less like that you'd find much more religiosity among the 40-year-olds than the 20-year-olds. I'm not sure about that, but my sense is that's hit every American religious group. But you are absolutely right to point out that there is a fervor and a vigor in the Pentecostal community that's not there in other Protestant communities, for sure, I think. So it should also be said that Pentecostalism has always had a pretty strong track record in urban areas. And immigrants tend to go to urban areas, not exclusively, but disproportionately. So that also makes sense, whereas people who've been here several generations, white or black, for example, are more likely to spread out to the suburbs. And when they do, they detach from the house of worship that maybe was very important to them when they lived in the urban neighborhood. That's something that would be as true of Jews as of black people.
And so urban, Mark, that the modern day, and you probably know this, the modern day Pentecostal movement started in what's now Little Tokyo in downtown Los Angeles. So,
I know.
so
Yeah.
we're the home where the whole thing started. I just want to remind viewers, we welcome your questions. Please include, if you wouldn't mind, your first name and the location where you're watching our conversation with Mark Oppenheimer. We look forward to hearing the questions that you have there. And so many good ones. I'm going to sprinkle some in early on. A number of people asking whether affiliation with religious institutions is the best measure of spirituality, the so-called unchurched metric, or is there a better way of getting at what people's beliefs about God or spiritual views really are?
Absolutely. I mean, what a good question, right? Affiliation doesn't in any way correspond to, or it doesn't in any way predict on a one-to-one basis belief in God or belief in anything else. People affiliate for all sorts of reasons. And the better way of getting at what people believe is to have pretty good survey data to survey them. I do think that there is an interesting thing you can do to ask how strongly people believe. And this isn't perfect, which is to ask, what are they willing to sacrifice? What are you willing to give up for those beliefs? So if you believe that a particular theological teaching is important, are you willing to give money to people spreading that teaching? Are you willing to give time? Are you willing to volunteer? Are you willing to join a community that might ask something of you? So there is a way in which people who belong to communities, and again, that's by no means the only way. People should do what they want. I mean, America, I believe so strongly in religious freedom, and that is part of the promise of America. People should absolutely do what they want. But there is a way in which people who join communities, one of the things that happens when you're showing up at a community is that stuff gets asked of you. Will you take this meal to someone who can't cook? Will you go visit this person in the hospital? And a strong community will ask it of you pretty soon after you walk in the door. And it's a way to make you feel included, to give you meaningful work, to forge relationships. That's what happens when you show up, is people start asking stuff of you, and you might do it even if you don't believe in God or believe in the theology, but you're believing in something. Even if it's only the strength of the community in and of itself. When you're home on Zoom or taking a walk in the woods, and that's your spirituality, one of the pieces that is less active is the sense of what will you sacrifice or give up or do for others. And I do think, and again, those people might be, someone could be doing their religion on Zoom, but still writing big checks to charities and still doing all sorts of extraordinary works. I don't presume to know what's going on with any one individual. But I do, when I give talks and I hear people say, oh, pandemic, one of the upsides was I found this amazing congregation in Chicago or New York on Zoom, and now I hear my sermons and whatever on Zoom. But so I don't go or pay dues at my local little church on the corner anymore or synagogue. I do ask them, like, do you miss the people? Do you miss your neighbors?
Yeah,
or
yeah.
You probably used to do something like help prepare coffee hour or babysit the children in the kids' room. Have you replaced that with anything? And if you haven't, is it that your energy is going elsewhere, or is that you felt you'd given a lot over the years and you're ready to sort of take some more time to nourish your own thinking? And that's fine. People go through seasons of their lives where they give more and give less. Certainly, as somebody who has young children right now, my volunteer efforts and probably my financial giving have taken a real hit, for sure.
As they do at that stage. Yes.
As they do. So I'm in no position to judge. But I do think, to answer the implicit in that question is some sense of like, well, are these people less religious? In one sense, they probably are, in the sense of sacrificing for others in the community.
Reciprocal, yeah.
Reciprocity.
But to further complicate that, and you're Jewish and I'm not, so I'm really interested in your thoughts on this.
You're not yet, Larry.
It's not yet, that's right.
You're not yet.
Because I did want to talk about conversions to Judaism, because you just wrote about that a while back on Tablet. But I did want to ask you, there are so many American Jews who don't consider themselves religious, but are deeply entwined with the values of Judaism, even though they're not going to temple on a regular basis, or maybe even high holy days. but in the sense of Jewish culture and Jewish values, that's deeply ingrained in their lives. So they wouldn't define themselves as religious. In fact, they'd say they're
Right.
secular, cultural Jews,
Yeah.
but there clearly is something from the faith. It seems to
Um,
me as someone outside that does live on in that.
Well, I'm not sure there's something from the faith. There might be. This is really tricky territory. It's also very hard to talk about without making people feel judged. And I have loved ones in my family, in my community, among friends, who represent everything on that spectrum, from totally secular, even anti-religious, to quite devout and fervent in very traditional ways. And I think anyone leading any one of those kinds of lives can be an extraordinarily beautiful person living a good life. That includes, by the way, ultra Orthodox people, who some people farther to, say, the left, it's a bad term, but the left hold in contempt. I think that across the religious spectrum, there are people leading authentic and great lives, and we don't know. We really shouldn't be judging unless we really know them. Now, that said, a lot of what cultural Judaism, as rich and vibrant as it is, and it probably constitutes the bulk of my career in writing, is a one or two generation phenomenon. In other words, it is in some ways drawing on the memory. So if you are, if your Judaism has a lot to do with Hollywood movies or bagels or borscht belt humor, that's probably not going to be. That's probably not going to be a substantive Judaism for your grandchildren, because what you're doing is kind of using the rich cultural offshoots and detritus of a kind of mid-century Jewish American cultural flourishing. Not all of it's mid-century, some of it's older than that. Some of the cuisine's much older and whatever. But a lot of people are sort of still reveling in a cultural flourishing of post-war American Judaism in terms of novels, in terms of film, in terms of comedy, in terms of food, that frankly is attenuating all the time. And so, my own children don't really know who Jerry Seinfeld is, because they were born after Seinfeld went off the air. They certainly don't know who Mel Brooks is, even though almost nobody is more important to me, right? So, and are there new things that are replacing that in what constitutes a cultural Judaism? The other thing to say is that, of course, the cultural Judaism that a lot of people say is their Judaism is very, very Ashkenazi inflected. It's the Judaism of, to a great extent, Eastern European immigrants who came over between 1880 and the Immigration Act of 1924. So it discounts the experience. It's not a Judaism that has as much meaning if your ancestors are Sephardic or Persian. It's a very time and place specific cultural Judaism. Whereas if your Judaism is rooted in something coming out of Jewish holidays, let's say, which are in Torah for the most part, going back thousands of years, then that can sort of have more transgenerational continuity. But that's not everyone's bag. Some people would say that's right. Like, what I'm doing connects me to my grandparents, and if my grandchildren are doing something completely different, that's okay.
Well, I was thinking of things like social justice and
But here's the
philanthropy,
problem:
and
everyone believes in social justice. It is
well,
not.
but
You can't.
yeah,
You can't say.
everybody
You can't say
believes
social
in it,
justice
but
isn't social justice super Jewish. That sells out the
no,
Latino Pentecostals and Roman
no,
Catholics.
yeah. I completely agree. You're absolutely right. But I still think that there's a tremendous consistency in messaging in some of those values among the American Jewish community. And that's not to say supersede necessarily, but it is, to me, it is a big part of what Jewish culture has offered this country, is a heavy emphasis on those issues of fairness and justice and care for others. And it doesn't mean it's only American Jews, but I think it is a large part of
let me give you a big yes and a big no, right? On the one hand, yes, Jews, according to our traditions, we came up with ethical monotheism, right? We came up with the Golden Rule. We came up with the 10 Commandments. We are the people we came up with the prohibition against idol worship, right? We are the people who said that cultural relativism is wrong, that you can't, you can't say, well, our God says it's okay to rape, murder, pillage, therefore it's okay here. Jews are the ones who said there's one God, and that God has some rules, and the rules are, and we've adumbrated them and interpreted them, and we've made them more gender inclusive, and in all sorts of ways used them fruitfully. But the basic rules that you get in Torah are the fundaments of fairness, as we now understand it. So yes, like on the one hand, you're right. On the other hand, in contemporary America, there's a way in which the compliment you're offering can sound like saying, you're not saying it, but it can sound like Jews are a little bit better. They're a little bit fairer, a little bit more interested in justice, and we're not. I mean, we're as potentially terrible.
Jews are human like everybody else, of course.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, and that's not the argument I'm trying to make. It's just to me there seems to be some sort of a through line there. But if you don't, if it's not, then I see the point, because you know much more about it.
No, I know how terrible we are more than you know how terrible we are. No, I love this conversation with my Presbyterian friend. I take the point. There is, especially in the 20th century, there was a strong Jewish presence in a lot of social justice movements. And I think, for example, our communal publications, if you look at Jewish newspapers, podcasts, magazines, a lot of which I've worked for, maintain a strong interest in questions of justice, fairness, distributive justice, that I think are maybe not as prominent in other communities. So I take your point on an empirical level.
Okay, why don't let's move on.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's all right. No, I've enjoyed this, and I've learned a lot. I appreciate.
You're going to climb us out of that rabbit hole. I got you.
Roger asks, what is happening in America with affiliation?
Well, first of all, let me commend to you Jessica Gross's, that's this Grose. She's done a 5-part series in the New York Times in the past couple months about disaffiliation. I mean, what's happening literally is it's going way, 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 way down. But, and Larry, you talked about a lot of the reasons at the top of the hour. People having children later, having fewer, mobility. I mean, if we're gonna maybe be useful rather than being so vague and saying it's everything, mobility. The idea that people are going to uproot themselves and follow their job, move for jobs. We used to be a more stable population. Although interestingly, there's recent evidence that people are getting too stable and not moving enough for jobs. So this is complicated. But I guess what I would say is that affiliation thrives where people feel rooted in fairly specific communities that they don't plan to leave, or when they leave, they try to transplant into another community like that. And there is a way in which Americans, I don't know, wealth is hard on religion. If you say to Americans, would you rather go to a community? I mean, I've had this conversation actually. Would you rather settle in a community where property taxes are low, or where there's a really terrific church right in the neighborhood? A lot of people say, well, I'm going to go where property taxes are low, or where the zoning is such that I can get a 3-car garage. And I understand that because the American dream and freedom and the sense of having space of your own. I mean, I do. I'm not someone who wants to be in co-housing or communal living. I like the idea of having my own little house, but a house of my own,
Yeah.
But it's amazing how many people don't see the added value in, well, I'd like to be near a great church.
I think another factor on affiliation is, when going back to this post-war America where far fewer women worked. And so, men would get a lot of their sort of social interaction in the workforce, or whatever their men's group would be, that the lodge or club or whatever. For women, there was the need to build social connections because it was much more isolated for many of the women who were not in the workforce. And I wonder how much of that sort of women building the social net of the family was highly responsible for that. And now that we all work, it's kind of changed things.
I think that's a really important point. I'm glad you brought that up. And, the question of gender and sex overall is an important one here. So everything you said, I think, is true, which is that a lot of the churching and the voluntary life fell on wives. And when they have careers, often they don't do it because they don't have time, or they find it less interesting. They're actually more interested in their legal practice, just as their husband is, or if they're two women in a marriage, just as they both are. And so I think, that basically what you're talking about is opportunity. When you have opportunities to do more things, you're going to choose some of those other things. And that's going to mean that the odds that you're going to be super involved on various committees at the church or synagogue are going to go down. So I think that's a really, really important point. It is an interesting note that some of the communities that thrive are ones in which both there's an expectation. And I think this is a really interesting feminist point in a way, where there's an expectation that both parties of the marriage, male and female, and these are usually fairly traditional communities where it would be male and female, take a lot of the religious responsibility. So if you look at Latter-day Saints, as Mormons are asking to be called by their more formal name, and if you look at Orthodox Jews, both communities where the community only functions if a lot of men are willing to take certain ceremonial roles. And that the children think of religion as something that men and women both do. And those are more robust communities, because now it's not to say that it's because they say, oh, isn't this a wonderful shared gender values, because these are communities that actually have fairly traditional gender roles.
Yeah,
but
it
it
can be
is
quite patriarchal. Yeah.
They can be quite patriarchal, but they can also be places where you're just a lot more likely to find a man in synagogue or in church than in less patriarchal communities. So that's just an interesting twist.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me, Sally, I see you asked the same question about women in the workforce and the effects. So sorry, I took your question. I hadn't seen that before. Robin asked, since a relative minority of Americans attend services weekly, why do you think so many see atheists and agnostics still as immoral?
Yeah. Well, I think this goes back to a lot of what we've been talking about, which is there is a pretty big chunk of Americans who are not interested in going to services in the building, but who see themselves as spiritual. And there is this cultural legacy that atheism, there were, I haven't seen surveys lately, but as recently as say 5 years ago, when they asked people, one of the great questions, I can't remember if it was Gallup or Pew, that would ask people, would you vote for a Jew for president? Would you vote for a Muslim for president? Would you vote for an LGBTQ person for president? Would you vote for an atheist? I mean, atheists were regularly very near the bottom of the list, along with, regrettably, Muslims. I mean, you saw all the prejudices, all the kind of bigotries, and atheists were pretty far down. You saw a lot of this scholarship around the time that Mitt Romney was running for president, because the question of whether a Latter-day Saint or Mormon could become president was it seems not to be a factor for very many voters. He didn't win, but there's not a lot of data that shows that being LDS cost him the presidency.
That's why he lost. Yeah, right.
And 50 years earlier, I mean, when his father was running for president, it was seen as in 68, right? It was seen as a huge negative. So, but atheists still have that taint on them. And I think that's a weird legacy.
And it makes me question, Pew's most recent survey, I'm sure you saw, 7% of respondents describe themselves as atheists. That's been fairly consistent over the past, I think, 2 decades. But I wonder how real that is, because there is a stigma, I think, for many, whether that depresses the number of people who, if it were seen as a value neutral designation, would identify themselves as atheist.
It's also just kind of a bad term. Nobody really knows what it means. Does it mean you don't believe in any metaphysics? I mean, everything is science and naturalism. What's astonishing to me as somebody who's, religious, but also quite scientifically oriented, which I don't see as a contradiction, is how many people believe in really, non-scientific pseudoscience, how many people, believe passionately there must be some truth to astrology, for example, that being a Leo or a Virgo or a Sagittarius says something about your personality, the life you're going to lead, etc. I mean, if you are one of those people, and the numbers are very high, probably you shouldn't say you're an atheist, because You may not be a churchgoer and you may not believe in organized religion, but you believe in this thing that in some ways strikes me as less plausible than the existence of a traditional theistic God. So you kind of believe in the sort of the unprovable, the unseeable, the untestable in the way that a God believer does. So I don't know, it's really tricky. Americans are weird. We're all weird.
I plead guilty. Several of the viewers would like your thoughts about the trend of religious beliefs influence on publicly funded schools. So Carol says Oklahoma, for example, has a public Catholic school being paid for by taxpayers, and ultra-Orthodox Jews are fighting for vouchers to pay for religious day schools.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. And I'm first of all, I should say I'm not a lawyer. My wife's the lawyer in the family. My wife, my sister-in-law, my dad, my brother-in-law, everyone's a lawyer except me. So I'm not the expert on, and I haven't closely been following the voucher debate but it's a little more complicated than people on the kind of church-state separationist left want it to be. For example, my understanding is that the courts, while traditionally being pretty strict about not letting public funds go to elementary and secondary schools, have long let public funds go to religious universities. So I think that Georgetown and Notre Dame and all of these great Catholic research universities get all kinds of public funds, and that distinct, the idea that somehow public funds never touch down on religion. My synagogue right now is getting lots of synagogues are getting security funds to make ourselves safer. Now you can say, well, that's just for security, but of course money is fungible, and so if you had to reinforce your doors anyway, and now you get a grant of $100,000 from the government to help you reinforce your doors, that may free up some money to run Hebrew school or something. So there's a lot of government money going to religion and religious bodies, and the idea that this was something invented by George W. Bush with his Office of Faith-Based Initiatives or whatever it's just not true. So knowing that and having seen so much of that in my journalistic work, I'm a little less I'm reluctant to draw kind of fierce conclusions one way or the other. The other thing I'll say, as I dodge the question, is that other countries, including some very, very progressive countries and very secular countries, tax communities and redirect money to religious schools. I think there are parts of Canada that does that. I think in Germany they do that. There are lots of countries that basically say, look, the Catholic schools are educating kids we would otherwise have to educate. So what's wrong with giving them a little stipend per child to do it? I mean, they're saving the public schools money. Another little just wrinkle is school buses have long been allowed. I know this. I was on a school bus as a child that took some of us to public school, but first dropped off some kids at a Catholic school in Massachusetts, and that was seen as constitutional. So I understand people's concerns about the encroachments, and I don't think the government should be in the business of running parochial or religious day schools. But I also think it's always been more complicated than many of us think.
Pamela asks, what's your explanation for the strong evangelical following of Trump, and how do they justify his moral and legal breaches?
Well, I mean, I would say that, look, there's no one justification, and Trump voters are not a monolith at all. There are as many justifications probably as there are Trump voters. And as there are, for Biden voters or Clinton voters or Obama voters. Look, certainly a lot of them will say that if they take something like abortion seriously, if you believe that the end of Roe v. Wade, such as has now been achieved, will save millions of lives because you believe that abortion is the taking of a life, then it's not hard to understand why they would swallow misgivings about Trump and his private life or his 3 marriages or whatever to get the Supreme Court that you want. And I think that, look, certainly I knew lots of people who I think were insufficiently attentive to Bill Clinton's foibles because they wanted the policy results he was going to get. And I think that's pretty consistent across human nature, that we overlook a lot of foibles if people are going to give us what we want. So, but is there also just willing blindness about some of these things? Sure. Yeah. There
well,
is.
and even now with the Republican primary field, with an opportunity to support other Republican candidates who hold similar views on abortion policy, it's still Trump, who's way out in front of the field, at least at this point, even though there's not a lot of daylight between any of those candidates on abortion rights.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is above my pay grade. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a pollster. I will say that one useful thing to think about is you say, well, how can you do that if you're actually an evangelical voter who takes the Bible seriously? Lots of people, I mean, as another questioner implied, lots of people who identify as churchgoers are not particularly spiritual or religious. I mean, there are a lot of people who, I always said in the 80s and 90s and aughts when the Southern Baptist Convention was riding high, I said, not all of these people, you understand, are passionate about the moral truth of Christ. A lot of them see membership in the Southern Baptist Convention or another evangelical denomination as a good signifier in a Republican town. Like,
So like the post-World War II values demonstration we were talking about earlier. Mark,
absolutely.
We have a number of people that would like a little bit more discussion about the internet and social media and its effect. And are people finding community online, for example, so they don't need to have in-person community?
I mean, look, sorry, that was too flippant. Of course, some people are finding community online. I especially want to note that people who have poor mobility, who have trouble getting out of the house, either because of mental illness, physical illness, disabilities, all sorts of challenges, that for many of these people, the ability, or if they're from a marginalized group and there aren't a lot of representatives of their group, be it a sexual group, gender group, racial group, marginalized group, and there are very few people like you in your physical community, in your town or region. The ability to find kindred spirits, or again, if you can't get out of the house for whatever reason, even temporarily, right? You've had an injury and you can't get to church or a ball game or to play chess, and all of a sudden you can play, because I'm a chess player, and all of a sudden you can play chess online. It's a huge gift, and I don't ever want to minimize the upside of social media or the internet. However, do I think it's had an upside in general, if you could quantify these things? No, it's been enormously deleterious for society. It has raised the amount of, I always say, 30 or 40 years ago, you could go weeks without anyone saying something mean to your face. They might say something mean behind your back, but you'd say hi to your neighbors, you'd say hi to your coworkers, and people were generally decent to each other face to face. And now, if you say anything on Facebook, people will be mean to you right away. And we have become so coarsened. The expectation that we will be exposed to cruelty on a regular basis is so high. And of course, it's also a major distractor. You can't run a classroom if students are on their phones, as I know well as a teacher. We are going to look back on this moment and see it as a period of collective madness, and we will retrench from it. We will find our sanity again, and we will know. I always draw the analogy. There will come a time when we will no sooner take out a phone in class than we would take out a cigarette in class. It'll just be uncool.
We in your close, we have a chance to revisit religious life in America, but you wrote the book, of course, that we were talking about earlier about the Tree of Life Synagogue and about the community around it, Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh. Here we are almost 5 years after 11 lives were taken, 6 people seriously injured. And this morning, the federal jury unanimously decided death is the proper sentence for the killer. Your reflections on this day and where we sit almost 5 years later.
Well, I mean, my main thought, as has been reported, there was division in the community of those left behind, families of the dead. There were 2 people who spoke out, including one survivor, Rabbi Jonathan Perlman, and one widow, Miri Rabinowitz, saying, please don't impose the death penalty. And then there were 7 people who spoke out who had lost loved ones who said, please do. It shows that there's diversity within Judaism. I'm not a supporter of the death penalty, so I regret this decision personally. But I also thought it wouldn't come to this. I thought there'd be a plea deal probably so that this wouldn't happen. I didn't know when the crime first happened if the Department of Justice, because it's a federal crime, killing someone in a house of worship. I didn't know if a Biden or whoever, a Democratic DOJ taking over from a Trump DOJ, would seek the death penalty, but they did, and it was imposed. So, now there'll be a lot of appeals. I don't think, I don't know what it changes for American Judaism, but I'm almost at a loss for words. I wish I had something more articulate, but I've spent a lot of years now thinking about this crime and reporting on this crime for that book. And I wish all the survivors and peace. It's a horrible thing to lose a relative to murder.
The piece you wrote, I think it was for Tablet, about a survivor going back and visiting the synagogue. Very poignant, very deeply moving piece, Mark.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. In the book, definitely one of the scenes that I thought was most important was Dan Leger going back inside, revisiting the site where he was shot. He survived. His best friend, Jerry Rabinowitz, was killed next to him. And, he got permission from the FBI to go back inside the building and retrace his steps, which he felt was a very powerful thing. And it's something that he's talked very movingly about. But, moving on is very hard, and people do it differently. And of course, there's a sense in which you never move on. So, it's all easy for me to say. I'm just a reporter, and I didn't live any of it.
But it is the excerpt that I read from Freeman Brook Squirrel Hill, very, very, very powerful. Well, I want to give you about like 30 to 45 seconds, just very briefly, to kind of wrap up your sense. Where are we going to see a rebound of religion in America and affiliation, or is it cyclical or not? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think America, for various reasons, partly that we historically have welcomed immigrants, as we should, constantly gets new infusions of associational life, and some of it will be religious life, some of it will be athletic life. I mean, the soccer scene in New Haven is stronger because of mobility, because of immigration, because our cultural life is stronger because of this churn, and I think our religious life has a vitality to it and a potential to it that in countries that are anti-immigration they don't. So I think that's interesting. And look, there are always spots. There are synagogues in America and churches that are getting thousands of people, and some are conservative, but some are not. And so I think it never ceases to be interesting. I want to, but I think that the great threat to it is not such sort of secularization as an idea, which I think is fine, but the idea that, especially after the pandemic, that we would all retrench onto digital avenues and onto Zoom and like that. And I think it's an important thing. I love reaching lots of people through events like this. And then I hope that we all tomorrow see someone in person at a coffee shop or house of worship and talk about it.
And I keep thinking about what you said earlier about people going to their house of worship, and that there was a mix of people's worldviews. Aside from the shared faith, there was a mix of, and even among faith, there are people that are more liberal, more conservative, even theologically, in those houses of worship. And I hope that in some way that we can recapture that and become less in our silos, because I think there's tremendous value in that. Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been such an honor.
I really, really appreciate it. I've learned a lot from you. Thank you so much. Mark Oppenheimer with us. And I just want to encourage you, as Janice said at the outset, this is an organization, these two organizations, I should say, Community Advocates, Inc. and Jews United for Democracy and Justice, that come together, put on these incredible programs that deal with issues that are so important to us, not all political, a range of very important issues that we're all trying to grapple with in a world that we often struggle to understand. So please make your tax-deductible contribution for these programs on the website of either Judge or Community Advocates, Inc. Please join America at Crossroads next Wednesday, when former ambassador to Moscow and renowned Russian scholar Mike McFaul is the guest. He'll be in conversation with Stanford and Hoover Institution, a colleague of Mike McFaul, Larry Diamond. They'll be talking about momentous events in Russia and Ukraine. That's next Wednesday, August 9th, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Please join us then. Thank you so much from all of us at America at Crossroads. Have a very good evening.